So I'm going to talk today about some work that some of the folks in my lab are doing in the sort of coastal nearshore region near Woods Hole, and then also on a regional scale, sort of covering sort of Long Island all the way up into the Gulf of Maine. My background is primarily as a blue water oceanographer. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the fate of carbon dioxide that's released from fossil fuel burning. And that's Ali mentioned my interest in ocean acidification. That was fossil fuel carbon gets into the ocean, changes the seawater chemistry, trying to understand what the impact of that might be on biological organisms, but also just to the accounting of how much of that carbon is stored in the ocean rather than staying in the atmosphere. That sort of naturally led to interest in connecting that to the near shore, because the near shore is experiencing both that large-scale climate and ocean acidification signal, as well as a lot of more regional scales associated with nutrient pollution, hypoxia, and other changes. And so I'm going to try to cover a couple of little vignettes. I don't know about the culture here, but everybody's got a very different background. So if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense or you have a question, just sort of stop me along the way. Because I want to cover a couple of different vignettes of different aspects of what we've been doing. The first part is some work very locally in Buzzards Bay, looking at eutrophication and building off of a citizen scientist program that's been going on there for a couple of decades. And then I'll move offshore and look at some acidification work, and then depending on how time goes, we'll look at some large-scale remote sensing that we've been doing to try to link into these in situ water column studies. So Buzzards Bay, this is just to give you a sense of Buzzards Bay. That yellow line is the outline of the watershed. It's a really interesting system to study because there's roughly 24 small little coastal embayments around the edge of Buzzards Bay. So you have change going on in the bay itself, and then change being driven in these different embayments, some of which are in urban environments. So this is New Bedford right in here. You have a lot of agriculture down here in Westport. You have urbanization going on the Cape in terms of lots of summer homes, growing population. And so it gives you sort of this cross spectrum of different conditions all in a region experiencing broadly the same regional climate trends. I had mentioned earlier a citizen scientist program, the Buzzards Bay Coalition, was started roughly 2 decades, a little more ago, with concern of degrading water quality. Lots of the economy and coastal communities around the bay are, their economy is supported by tourism, seasonal tourism, and so declines in water quality either affecting shellfishing or affecting people's ability to use the water has a big impact on very high public visibility. The coalition has been collecting water samples over the summer since the early 90s, and they've done some qualitative assessments. This is an index of nitrogen pollution that they release every few years. But we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into their data because nobody had really explored their data in any more than sort of a cursory mode. And so this is some work that's been led by Jenny Ruban, who's a technician in my group, and her paper came out earlier this year. So she started with a couple of decades worth of data at a whole variety of different spatial points. The little dots in each of the map give you a sense of the sampling locations along each of these embayments. So it's a citizen scientist group, so it comes with lots of both positive in the sense that you have lots of energy and lots of volunteers, but things change. Somebody was collecting samples from their dock, they've retired or moved on, and so some of the stations have moved around with time. So there was a lot of sort of behind the door data, behind the curtain data analysis to try to make the data set relatively clean. But here I'm just showing for some of the longer term records where we have more like a decade and a half at least of data, large-scale distributions for total nitrogen, chlorophyll, and dissolved inorganic nitrogen. The data set is primarily focused on nitrogen pollution and its impacts on water quality, where The dissolved inorganic nitrogen load is actually relatively low, but if you look at the total nitrogen, these are on a log scale, you have relatively high levels, particularly in some of the western coastal estuaries, and this is associated with human activities, atmospheric pollution, runoff from land, wastewater treatment plants, and I'll sort of go into a little bit of detail on that. You also see very eutrophic levels, or fairly high values, particularly on the western side in terms of chlorophyll biomass. And the amount of chlorophyll in the water column is important from a water quality perspective because it blocks the light, and we've seen a disappearance of a lot of the seagrass beds around the bay because of a buildup of plankton in the water column and a shift between a primarily benthic-driven productivity system versus a pelagic or water quality, a pelagic system. The disappearance of the seagrass beds has lots of implications in terms of loss of nurseries for different fisheries and overall decline in the health of the bay. So these are sort of large-scale patterns. We dug in a little bit deeper and did some first-order statistical analyses of the data. This is principal component or factor analysis of the data. We just wanted to see of these various variables that we've measured, everything from inorganic nutrient species, temperature, particulate organic nitrogen, chlorophyll. How are the variables related? How are these different quantities of water quality related? And what you see, this is the first two factors, is there's a group of variables that plot sort of on the left to right. So that's the first factor. And another group that plot on the up and down. So the x-axis versus the y-axis. And they're fairly distinct, which says that the variables like the total amount of particulate organic carbon and chlorophyll aren't strongly related. Their variability is not strongly related to the inorganic nutrients, which was a little surprising. The reason why the inorganic nutrients were included in the data set is people thought they'd actually be a strong indicator of nutrient pollution. You're adding inorganic nutrients, you would expect the inorganic nutrients to be a strong indicator of how much pollution you've added. But in these systems, the inorganic nutrients are drawn down relatively rapidly. And so most of the excess nitrogen gets stored in either biomass or detritus. The other thing you can do on the bottom panel is actually start to separate out the different embayments and estuaries based on their water quality behavior. And so the color coding on the left shows the different embayments, sort of blue starting over in Westport, coming all the way towards Woods Hole in red. And what you see is the embayments, mostly on the western side, all tend to clump together, have similar behavior. So everything on the western side, they're primarily river-fed estuaries. They're fairly heavily nutrient polluted and also high chlorophyll, versus the estuaries on the Cape Cod side, which are more groundwater. There aren't a lot of surface river flow on the Cape, and have plot on these in these sort of factor space in a different quadrant from the riverside. So this is sort of a first order description of the change spatially across the bay in these different embayments. Then we wanted to say, well, what's changing over time? Because that's one of the benefits of having this long-term record. These are the trends in total nitrogen, chlorophyll, and at the bottom, temperature. And if you start from the bottom in temperature, this is fairly consistent with other records. Coastal water, offshore water in New England has been warming since the sort of late 60s, early 1970s. And I'll show a longer-term record of that in a bit. And Buzzards Bay is no exception, where almost all of the embayments are seeing substantial warming over time. In the next panel up, chlorophyll, you're also seeing changes and increases in chlorophyll. So remember I said that the amount of phytoplankton, we're shifting to this sort of water column-based ecosystem. That's a good measure of the degradation of the estuary, is this increase in chlorophyll over time. But what's interesting is the top panel, the amount of total nitrogen. So this is nitrogen in all its forms, in phytoplankton and detritus and dissolved in the water, has only increased at a few places. for most of the system, it's been stable with time. And so one of the questions we have is, if nitrogen's not going up, why is chlorophyll going up? And is that an indication of a shift in the system associated with warming temperatures? To dig a little bit deeper into that, we wanted to look at where the sources of nitrogen are coming from. So this is a model that was put together by Shauna Williamson, who's now a graduate student down at VIMS. And she looked for each of those sort of roughly 24 or so embayments at the different sources of nitrogen. So the panel in the bottom is actually showing our estimates of the nitrogen load to these different estuaries. And you see they span orders of magnitude. It depends on the size of the watershed. If you have a big watershed with a lot of agriculture, you can get a lot of excess nitrogen to come in. In some cases, and if you look up at the top, I've sort of color-coded the different sources. So you'll see that there are systems where there's a lot of animal waste, the hatched lines, so that's a more agricultural source. There are other places where the darker gray bands are actually wastewater. So there's several wastewater treatment plants that are collecting nitrogen from across many different watersheds and then injecting it into where the discharge is. And then the lighter gray is just wastewater from septic. So a large part of this region is still on septic systems, so the nitrogen gets into the groundwater and then is transported over some time scale into the estuary. So large variations in nitrogen load affected by the local conditions. Digging a little bit deeper, I had mentioned that septic and wastewater treatment are important. One of the interesting things is over time the population, the number of houses in the watershed has increased, but the number of houses on septic has actually flattened and is actually going slightly down with time. So there's been a lot of effort to put more and more houses on sewer and then sewer into wastewater treatment plants. That's primarily happened on the west side where you see the red dots. Those are some of the major wastewater treatment plant discharge locations. The blue are smaller sites that are primarily discharging into groundwater. For example, the town of Falmouth actually discharges groundwater into West Falmouth Harbor. One of the advantages of wastewater treatment is that some of that nitrogen is actually removed. As you move to more and more sophisticated water treatment, you try to take out more and more of that nitrogen to reduce the pollution load. So this is a summary plot for the entire estuary, and starting with the dashed line is the wastewater treatment plant. What you see is that there was a major shift in the late 90s where there was a dramatic decline in the input of nitrogen from wastewater treatment plants associated with a shift from only primary treatment to secondary treatment, where they're actually trying to reduce the nitrogen. So there's actually been good progress, at least based on our analysis, and this is consistent with the fact that the nitrogen loads in the estuaries have not gone up with time in many of the embayments because of improvements in wastewater treatment plants. The other major factors are a decline in animal waste, and some of this is management activities and some of this is just economics. A lot of the agriculture has been pushed out because of development for households. And then the dark line is atmospheric deposition on a larger scale. So this isn't really emissions within the watershed itself, it's mostly emissions upwind, but things like changes in power plant regulations, changes in emissions from cars on sort of a New England, Northeast, even all the way to Ohio scale that have been leading to large-scale reductions in nitrogen. So in many ways, this is a good news story on a regional scale that we've seen declines in nitrogen over time. On a on a more geographically defined scale, however, we've seen declines on the western side of the basin, atmospheric deposition, wastewater treatment. But on the Cape side, blown up on the right, you see a pluses or zeros. There's, even with declines in atmospheric nitrogen deposition, the population growth, the fact that more and more houses are being built, they're all being built on septic. Septic is not the best thing to do if you want to limit nitrogen pollution. The Cape side is still seeing increases in load with time. So from a management perspective, a lot of progress on the western side, still places to go overall, and particularly on some of the Cape embayments. I wanted to come back to this question, well, if nitrogen is declining, how come the chlorophyll isn't declining? And so these two slides are sort of summaries. The first is showing the total nitrogen in the water column versus nitrogen load. So this is our model versus observations. And you see first that for higher nitrogen load, there is an increase in total nitrogen, but there's a lot of noise because of regional small-scale variations. But the other thing is, if you look at the color coding is temperature. And the warmer colors are warmer temperatures. And there is a tendency, and you can show this statistically as well, that for warmer conditions, you get more total nitrogen for the same nitrogen load. So even if nitrogen load is declining, if the temperatures are warming, you may actually see more nitrogen in the estuary. There's a couple of reasons that might be true. Temperature also correlates with precipitation. So we're seeing more precipitation, stronger precipitation events, and that may be washing nitrogen, more nitrogen into the system. The other is that with warmer temperatures, you're changing the ecology, and we're still trying to explore to be able to demonstrate this more clearly, but with a warming system, we may actually be retaining more nitrogen in the system and reducing some of the loss mechanisms. On the right-hand side is, once you've got the nitrogen in the system, how does that relate to chlorophyll? The blue line is the first decade of data, the red line is the second decade of data. Even for the same amount of nitrogen in the system, you're seeing more chlorophyll with time associated with these warmer conditions. And that can be, again, shifts in the plankton community, shifts between more living biomass. Under warmer conditions, phytoplankton tend to grow faster. So we may be seeing shifts between living and detritus, living and dead biomass, and also shifts in phytoplankton community composition. One of the great things of working with a long time series like this citizen scientist data set is you get to look into the past. The bad thing is you can't go back. Now we have all these wonderful ideas and questions we want to test, but we don't always have the data to test it because they weren't collecting the data that we need. But moving forward, this provides a great background for doing future experimental work. So I'm going to stop there and then transition into the next vignette. So if anybody has any pressing questions. Okay, I was going to make a Rick Murray joke now, but I'll see him tomorrow. So one of the other things we're interested in is coastal acidification and its impact on shellfish. And they're obviously linked because as you speed up the biology, as you add more nutrients to the system, more phytoplankton growth, phytoplankton take carbon dioxide out of the water, which eventually is removed from the atmosphere. And so if you ramp up a coastal system by adding more nitrogen, that extra carbon is going to go someplace. And when you either seasonally, when the bloom collapses and the bacteria consume the organic matter, they release the carbon dioxide back into the water. Or if you have depth stratification, you can have CO2 being pumped into the subsurface and building up CO2 as well. And the combination of that, we sort of call coastal acidification, can lead to really high CO2 levels in these estuarine waters. Now, some of this is natural, but as you add nitrogen to the system, you can build that up higher and higher. And we've been doing some field work the last couple of summers, actually last couple of years, to collect data on pH and other measures of acidification in these coastal embayments. Further offshore, the main source of acidification is just atmospheric carbon dioxide. As that's gone up with time, you build up more carbon dioxide in the water. It just equilibrates with the atmosphere. Now, my one chemistry slide. If you're not a chemist, well, sorry. So what happens when you add carbon dioxide to seawater? So carbon dioxide quickly, at seawater pH, quickly hydrates with water. The effective reaction is that CO2 hydrates with water, forms carbonic acid, and then the carbonic acid falls apart. And if you look at it in detail, the effect is that CO2 ends up combining with carbonate ion. That's that top reaction formed by carbonate. So the water becomes more acidic, and you also reduce the amount of carbonate ion in seawater. Now, the reason that's important is the second reaction, which is carbonate ion plays a role in controlling the solubility of calcium carbonate. So there's lots of different plants and animals that build shells and skeletons out of calcium carbonate. And so as you add CO2 to the water, it becomes more acidic. It makes it harder for plants and animals to grow their shells and skeletons. And this is just a summary plot from Sarah Cooley's paper. She was a postdoc and then a technician in my group. She's now moved off into the NGO world. But it's looking at, as you move left on this plot, the water's getting more acidic. Calcium carbonate, the solubility of calcium carbonate is declining. And it's comparing that to the relative growth rate of mollusks. And so as you move left on the plot, it's harder for the organisms to grow under the more acidic conditions. Similarly, this is the bottom panels are from Christy Croker's some meta-analysis work she's done showing that under acidified conditions, survival rates drop, calcification rates drop for mollusks, as well as growth and development rates. So at least for many of the mollusks and many of the shellfish that we depend upon, there's strong evidence, at least from laboratory studies, that they're sensitive to changes in seawater chemistry. If we look offshore, so the top panel is the Gulf of Maine, so New Hampshire. New Hampshire's on the left, George's Bank is on the right. The bottom panel is coming off of Massachusetts, so that's the continental shelf down onto the slope. This is the upper few hundred meters of the water column. The blue and purple are regions that are fairly naturally acidic because of organic matter raining from above. And our concern is that as atmospheric CO2 goes up, we're now well past 400 parts per million. So pre-industrial atmospheric levels were about 280. We're now at 400. We haven't seen 400 for several million years. The planet hasn't seen 400 parts per million atmospheric CO2 for several million years. We're now entering a space that many of these organisms are not adapted to. And so it's a question of, over time, will this buildup in atmospheric CO2 have effects either near shore, where you also have the impact of nitrogen pollution, or offshore, where you're mixing atmospheric CO2 from the surface down into the water column. This is more than just a question of scientific interest. Many of the shellfish in this region form the basis for very valuable either commercial or recreational fishing. This is just for commercial fishing. This is showing the different panels are decades. And so I'm not sure everybody can see the numbers at the bottom, but in inflation-adjusted dollars, the Northeast fishery has gone from about a $500 million industry to about $1 billion industry. And this is just the value of the catch that the fishermen bring to the dock. It doesn't count all the additional economic add-ons through processing and retailing. So over time, the value of the fishery has gone up, even adjusting for inflation. But the other interesting thing is the mix of species in the fishery has changed dramatically. In the early part of the 60s, you see lots of different colors. And as you move forward in time, the sort of middle band of multicolored rainbow has declined. A lot of that is things like groundfish. And it's been replaced by two species. Pink is lobster, blue is scallop. So it's a more valuable fishery, but it's now value concentrated. More than half the fishery value is concentrated in only two species, both of which are potentially sensitive to ocean acidification. And so this has implications beyond just ecology. We've been looking particularly at the sea scallop fishery. And so we work a lot with folks at the Northeast Fishery Sciences Center down in Woods Hole and in other parts of the Northeast. And this is a really interesting fishery. The fishery has sort of two major components. If you look at the map on the left, there's one fishery component that's in the Mid-Atlantic Bight, and then another on George's Bank. There's a much smaller box in the Gulf of Maine, but it's not heavily commercially fished. Over time, the fishery saw a dramatic improvement with improved management in the late 90s. So the landings and the value more than doubled around the turn of the century. And that was because improvements in management reduced pressure on juvenile scallops. And that's part of the reason why these are such an important component of the overall fishery, is because it's actually better managed with time. If you look at the blue bar, it's actually gotten bigger. And in part, that's because it's now a better managed fishery. And so one of our questions is, well, with climate change and acidification, will we be able to continue to have such a productive and valuable fishery? So we, being a modeler, data analysis person, I didn't grow scallops in the lab. I actually tried to work and built a little, we call it an integrated assessment model, because there's three components. The orange is a biogeochemistry model. So this is atmospheric carbon dioxide goes up. How does that change seawater chemistry? The blue component is a scallop biology model. How quickly do they grow? How sensitive are they to fishing predation, to other mortality losses, to acidification, to warming? And then the green component is a socioeconomic model. What are the rules for the fishery? How does the fishery respond to changes in regulation, to changes in the size of the stock? And then how does that feed back on, for example, if the population starts to decline, what does the fishery do? And then how does the fishery respond to things like changes in fuel prices, changes in demand? So we put that all together, and I'm just going to show a couple of results from that. The first is one scallop biology submodel result. Scallops are really interesting. Sea scallops are very long-lived for mollusks. You know, most of my work has been with plankton that have life cycles of a few days. Scallops take a couple of years before they're sexually mature, and they can live decades. And in fact, the way this population works, and let me explain this, is the plot is showing years down the y-axis. So this is year 2000, 2012, and then across this direction are shell heights, or shell size. And so if anybody's familiar with biological modeling, this is a little population matrix model. Is we start with really small little scallops, and those scallops grow with time. And what you see in the model and in the data is, at the very beginning, these are observations, there was a cohort of scallops in year 2000, and over time, they get larger. And then there's another cohort that comes in, and they get larger with time. Similarly, you see the same thing in the model. you see these cohorts. And the blue arrow at the top, that's when we can start harvesting the population. And so we need to know something about the timing of these cohorts going through the population in order to figure out what the fishery can actually see and can actually harvest. And given the crude nature of our model, we were actually pretty happy that we actually see a pretty good correspondence between the observations on the left, the model on the right. These are for the two different populations, the Mid-Atlantic and the Georges Bank. We think that they're relatively independent, both in terms of being fisheries and also stocks.
Is there all data available, like 2 million of data, million of shell sizes?
This is the data that's being used by the National Marine Fisheries. There are also, this is primarily from dredge surveys. There's a lot of really great work being done with camera surveys, but we haven't incorporated that yet. It's a little hard to, there's not complete agreement how to rectify those two. So then we can take the model and we can run it forward in time, and this is just showing two scenarios. So the red is a constant scenario. This is, we're not having any changes in climate, we're not having any changes in acidification. We're starting with the observed, so if you look at the biomass in the middle left, the solid red line is the historical observation, so you see the ramp up with the improved management, and then we let the model go, and the model tends to settle, the population declines a little bit, but then the red stays stable, and the band is, we do it, has a stochastic component, so we do a couple hundred different simulations with slightly different variations in parameters and assumed recruitment rates. But the red shows a stabilization of biomass, landings, revenue, and also the fraction of large scallops. That's economically important. You can get more money for large scallops than small scallops. And then the blue, we turned on climate change. So pH starts to decline with time, temperature goes up. We see a drop in biomass, drop in landings all the way through. Now, we're not suggesting that the population's going to collapse. This is run out for 2050, but you do see a fairly substantial decline. And so one of the things we're working on right now with the folks at the Fisheries Center is different strategies for playing with management rules that could recover parts of this loss in the fishery. What would you, if you made the rules tighter, would the stock do better and compensate for some of these changes in climate and acidification? So I have one more component. So if anybody has any quick questions on that little vignette. God, you guys are a quiet crowd. I gave this talk a few weeks ago at Harvard and they weren't as quiet. So the last component is we've now been trying to look broader at what we call regional seascapes and climate. And in part because we're interested in more than just acidification, we're also really interested in temperature. So the top panel is showing the long-term record over time in temperature. This record actually extends back well into the early part of the 20th century, but what you see is that particularly the last decade or so, you've seen a dramatic warming over the sort of northeast shelf ecosystem. There have been large changes in both fisheries and ecology at the same time. The bottom panel on the left is showing the catch for lobster. The Gulf of Maine fishery has just skyrocketed over the last couple decades, and the southern New England fishery, the inshore fishery for lobster, has pretty much collapsed. There's still a bit of a fishery offshore on the continental shelf, but in nearshore waters, it's almost completely disappeared. And there's a lot of indications that this may be related to climate warming and the appearance of shell diseases that tend to attack the lobster, that they might be either the disease vector grows better under warmer temperatures, or the lobster's more stressed at warmer temperatures. Lobster don't like it. If the water gets above about 20 degrees Celsius, the lobsters really do not like it. Similarly, large-scale population surveys, this is some work from Penske and Fogarty, has been migrating northward with time, consistent with the fishery catch. So to get to lobster, the lobsters live on the bottom. Sea scallops also live on the bottom. We don't have nearly as much data for bottom temperature as we would like. So that's just the bottom left is showing the data density. So the blues are relatively few data points. So there's a lot of data out on Georges Bank, less so in some of the other places. So we've been trying to figure out, while everybody's putting out their robots and gliders, which is great, we've also been trying to figure out ways of using satellite data and other methods to look historically at how we could estimate bottom temperature from things like bathymetry and stratification, wind stress, sea surface temperature. I won't go into detail, but it's an intermediate level machine learning approach where we allow the data to describe categories, or we call them seascapes, regions that have similar environmental properties, and then develop regressions for each of those seascapes. And the training data sets on the top and the validation sets on the bottom, just to show that there's actually some agreement for the validation data set when we've held some data out between the predicted and the actual bottom temperatures. This was particularly relevant for folks who've been watching the news recently. We have a new national monument that's been announced for the Northeast Atlantic. So it's along the continental shelf, and then some of the seamounts off of Georges Bank. And so, one of the interesting things is how our changes in climate and changes in other activities, we're going to limit human disturbances in this region, but that's not going to limit the impact of warming temperatures and acidification. So developing methods to monitor that with time. So this is looking at the broad trends. The left-hand side is sea surface temperature. So I said earlier that this whole region's been warming over time. And then the right is our estimate of where warming is happening on the bottom. And what's interesting is there's a lot of warming, or at least predicted warming, on parts of Georges Bank, out on Browns Bank, closer to Nova Scotia, less so in the mid-Atlantic. And so we're now working with some of the physical oceanography groups to see if we can understand what the causes of this are. But then moving forward in time, we can couple this type of analysis with climate projection models. So these are these large Earth system models that are used primarily for global simulations, but we can take the output from those, downscale that to the region, and then start making predictions for different scenarios. This happens to be the number of days over 20 degrees Celsius, which is a good cutoff for lobster and also for scallop. If you start to get too many of these warm days, you start to see declines in the population. And this is showing the blue is a policy, is a scenario that tries to limit warming globally. But even there, the ocean warming continues with time, just more gradually, even after you've capped off CO2 emissions. And then the red is more of a business as usual. And so this starts to give us some sense of what are the ecosystem and ecological indicators we'd want to be looking at given these projections in climate. So I'm going to wrap up here. I just want to say that the work that we've been doing is part of a larger scale project that was funded by the MacArthur Foundation. And there's two other components. One is a sea level rise component and coastal flooding that Jeff Doney at the Oceanographic is leading, very timely given, from Sandy to Matthew. And then a second component is ocean warming and fisheries that Glenn Gawarkowitz is leading, where they're working closely with the fishing community and actually just like our citizen scientist program for water quality, they're trying to provide instruments to the fishing fleet so that they can be part of the science of understanding this changing ecosystem. So I'll stop there and take questions.